and if they may be members of Venezuelan gangs, or if they, they can be deported. That's not the issue. The issue is we need to know the facts. They need to be given notice. They need to be given the right to go before the court. And now you have the Supreme Court saying you have to give them that due process. And then if they're deported legally, if they're deported in a way that is consistent with the law, that's all anybody could ask. In this case last night, though, I thought it was very interesting. The Supreme Court said, basically, we're going to follow the district court judge. They have to effectuate the return, not in a way that's going to get in the way of what Danny was talking about, the president's powers. And then the district court judge remodifying his order to be very consistent with the Supreme Court. So I guess just on general principle, general law, it's a very strong declaration by the Supreme Court. Now the question is, how does it get implemented?
Yeah, I do think that this opinion, I agree with Danny in that I think Roberts wanted a 9-0. I think he wanted everybody in the boat. And so they kind of played games with the semantics of this effectuate versus facilitate. The bottom line is this. The Supreme Court has unanimously told Donald Trump, you can't race to the airport with a bunch of people and get them out of the country and then claim you can do nothing about it. That no longer can happen. That game is over. And that's really the takeaway here. And we had a Trump judge yesterday also basically citing the Supreme Court, saying you've got to give notice, you've got to have a hearing. And that's really what I think we need in this country is the court to unanimously, even if the language was a little hinky and they're going to have to go back and figure out the difference between effectuate and facilitate, it still is very strong that our Supreme Court unanimously said, no, Donald Trump, you can't do this, not in the United States of America.
Well, and that message also, of course, Jonathan Lemire, gets to members of ICE, members of other people who are getting instructions to do something that, again, if these were 5-4 decisions and they were ambiguous, that would be one thing. It may be ambiguous in the application of it, but the overall legal theory, the Supreme Court in both of these cases saying, as Claire said, unanimously. Again, this is like Nixon, U.S. v. Nixon when it was 8-0, unanimously. In this case, unanimously saying you can't round up people in the middle of the night. You can't grab people off the streets. You can't throw them in the back of the vans. You can't throw them on airplanes and then fly them, to El Salvador or somewhere else without giving them due process first. Again, there's, the devil's always in the details in both of these rulings. But the fact is the Supreme Court has now spoken out unanimously saying what we saw the first couple of months of the administration cannot happen moving forward.
Yeah, as we're so fond of saying on this show, two things can be true at once. There's some wiggle room. There's some details Danny rightly pointed out that are still up for debate. But this is still a message sent, 9-0, from the Supreme Court. But lots of questions remain unanswered. This is not the only individual who attorneys and activists have said was improperly detained and deported. What happens to those others who are also in that El Salvador prison or who are also being held, like the tough student, like the Colombia activist in a prison in Louisiana right now, waiting for more legal proceedings? We also don't know, of course, Sam Stein, whether or not the Trump administration will listen. And that's, I feel like, the big part here is this dangerous moment is we keep hearing from this administration saying, oh, well, we're not going to defy court orders. We're not going to defy court orders, even though at times they have deflected. They've taken loopholes. They've attempted to get around them. They have claimed, anyway, they have not flat out refused them. This seems to be setting up a moment, if they don't cooperate here, where that could be. They could be defying not just any court, but the Supreme Court. Talk to us about this moment.
No, it's incredibly delicate, right? And I think we're all just sort of waiting to see what they do in response to this. I kind of count myself in the Danny camp, I guess, where they'll try to take a very narrow reading of this. maybe deport this man to a different country, maybe put him in Gitmo and say, well, we followed your order, and that's not really the spirit of the order, but it's technically under the order. But ultimately, look, I have to agree with Claire and Joe on this one, in that we had a situation in which the first Supreme Court decision said everyone is granted the right to a habeas petition. And then it raised the question, well, what if the administration decides, you know, we're going to get people out of the country before that petition could be heard? And then we're going to say, you know, they're in some foreign jurisdiction and it's no longer our responsibility. That was the nightmare scenario. If the Supreme Court said, well, once they go into El Salvador, yes, you're right, there's no jurisdiction. You can't do anything about it. That was the nightmare scenario. And what we have here, at least, is a situation in which the court says, no, you can't just do that. You can't just whisk people away without due process rights. You have to follow some normalcy, some normal rules. And now we wait, I guess. It's kind of an uncomfortable, scary proposition that we're just sort of waiting to see whether the White House will play cute with the law, whether they'll respect the law, or whether they'll violate it outright.
Well, and the question is, again, Pablo, how they implement this and how aggressively they implement it, which probably won't be that aggressively, how they try to get around this. But they will continue to say, we are following court orders. They're going to continue, most likely, if you listen to what they've said the first 3 months, and if that continues forward, they may continue to try to do that. Again, though, the law is out there, and it can't underline this enough. When you're going against 9 Supreme Court justices, you can't dismiss Clarence Thomas as a left-wing Marxist lib judge when he's agreeing with the district court judge, who is an icon to so many conservative jurists in Washington, D.C., who they've dismissed as a Marxist. So now you've got Clarence Thomas, the ultimate conservative icon for a lot of legal scholars, saying, yeah, that district court judge that is at the center of the conservative legal movement in Washington, D.C., yeah, they're not Marxist judges. They're agreeing with the entire Supreme Court. You guys did it the wrong way the first 3 months. Bring him back, and let's get this right.
It is really worth, I think, highlighting how extreme and how incompetent the process that this administration undertook with this story is, Joe. I often wonder, is it malice? Is it incompetence? In this case, it seems safe to assume there is both. And the incompetence, you know, it sort of accounts for that gap between, is this outright defiance? Is this circumvention of our justice system? I just keep on thinking of the tweet sent by the president of El Salvador. Once the planes took off, I'll just quote it for you here. Oopsie, ... too late, crying emoji. You know, what this is, just to be very blunt about it, is clearly one country that is not really in favor of the rule of law cooperating with another country that is not really in favor of the rule of law. And it's hard to distinguish, is there a good guy in that dynamic, even vaguely? And so Danny, when I think about this story of how this is about cooperation with a country that has suspended parts of its own constitution, that has jailed people without due process, I would just like people to immediately know, when I describe that dynamic, which country I'm talking about, El Salvador or the United States. It seems even grander than merely, wow, a Supreme Court ruling was pretty clear on this. There's something even larger being orchestrated.
Yeah, well, first, I encourage everyone, take a look, Google CCOT, where these folks are being held. I've heard people refer to it or compare it to Supermax, ADX Florence here in Colorado. Supermax is a resort compared to what's going on at CCOT. There are any number of YouTube documentaries you can check out right now. I've never seen anything like it, and I've spent a lot of time in prisons. CCOT is a nightmare. So the fact that someone's being held there is significant. The other thing, too, and I go back to the Supreme Court's order, what Joe was referring to earlier is exactly right. To some degree, there's a contract between the U.S. and El Salvador for the holding of these detainees, or whatever you want to call them, prisoners now. So there's a pressure point. That could be something that any of these courts could have said, well, if you have a contract, we find that you're not as helpless, administration, as you say you are. You can contract to send them there. You can contract to bring them back. But the orders don't say that. The Supreme Court didn't direct that. And again, I hate to sound so pessimistic, but this isn't exactly a unanimous order. It's a no noted dissent. There's a subtle difference. That means that some of the justices may have disagreed, but they didn't do so publicly. Whether that's Clarence Thomas or somebody else, I don't know. But does it matter really for purposes of what the lower court is directed to do? Probably not, but it might be a sign of what I think Claire was saying earlier, which is very telling, that maybe this was really about Roberts wanting to get